I leave the stage to Simon Mellins, who is a digital publishing accessibility consultant, with a speech. This title is Unlocking Knowledge, Unlocking Markets, Preparing Academic Publishing and E-Learning Content from the European Accessibility Act and other global accessibility legislation.
Right. Good morning, everybody. I realize you've heard an awful lot now, so there will be some repetition in here, so I'm going to skip over where that might happen. First, just to say thank you for inviting me to speak with such an impressive roster of speakers this morning. Really, we have some of the best people in the industry on this call. So for anybody listening, this is really a very powerful session to have been at and to hear all these brilliant people and their experiences. I'm going to talk about unlocking knowledge. Oh, just a minute, sorry. I'm going to talk about unlocking knowledge and unlocking markets, which is a positive spin on accessibility rather than the focus that you see in a lot of places around compliance. And I'm glad to see that we've had a lot of comments like that this morning already. So just briefly, who am I? I'm a digital publishing consultant. So I work with lots of different publishers and platform and software providers. I've got over 17 years of experience, having specialized in accessibility for the last 8 of those. I've worked across lots of different sectors within the publishing industry. Was a co-founder of the Publishing Accessibility Action Group in the UK, member of the Book Machine editorial board, and I host the Digital Publishing Podcast. We have some listeners in the audience today. This is just a slide showing some of the organizations I've worked with, but I won't bore you by reading through them. However, I'm not a lawyer. This is something that we all have to say a lot. So yes, when it comes to the European Accessibility Act, there is a lot of interpretation involved. So to be very clear, we are all doing that to the best of our knowledge and ability. We are not lawyers. I'm certainly not a lawyer. So nothing in this presentation should be seen as legal advice. Always get a company lawyer or retained counsel to sign off on any approach to accessibility. And with that in mind, let's talk a bit about the law. So as we've heard in great detail so far already today, the European Accessibility Act is indeed a directive, not a law, with an enforcement deadline of 28th of June 2025. Importantly, it uses the term ebooks, which was unusual for this type of legislation, but we shouldn't confuse that with EPUB. It is ebooks in a broader sense. It covers public and private sectors, products and services, content and platforms. And I've listed here some of the penalties that national legislation have cooked up for EAA transgressions, including the most aggressive in Ireland, where it's €60,000 and up to 18 months in prison. In each member state, a market surveillance authority is nominated, and they will be in charge of looking after how this happens. And I just wanted to also add that there's plenty of similar legislation arriving all around the world. I've added some of the regions here, so Africa, North and Latin America, East and South Asia, and the Middle East. Broadly speaking, meeting the requirements of the EAA will ensure content can be sold in most markets around the world. As Simon said just now, there is broadly speaking, these legislations all target the WCAG. So what are the requirements of the EAA itself? There's not a huge amount of detail in the EAA about what ebooks and platforms need to do. It says that we need to work well with assistive technology, a flexible and dynamic layout, which means having good structure underneath, alternative renditions of content, which is image and video descriptions, synchronized text for audio, which mainly refers to closed captions. DRM must not block assistive technology, as we have discussed today. The provision of accessibility metadata, and I agree with Simon, that's really, to me, that's an incredibly exciting part of this. And crucially, the EAA mentions the POUR principles from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So what are those? We have POUR, perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Perceivable content can be perceived in different ways. So this is the receiving of information part. Operable is about operating and interacting with content using any medium somebody needs. Understandable, so it's content being presented in predictable ways. And robust, there's an awful lot of issues out there with accessible technologies crashing because of something not being written well underneath. The requirement in the EAA for accessibility metadata is not clear in terms of what it means on the technical level, but it is broadly interpreted as being, for EPUBs at least, EPUB Accessibility 1.1, which goes inside the EPUB file, and ONIX Codelist 196, which goes in the XML companion file, which goes for any format. Broadly speaking, these have similar information in them, although there's slightly different wording. But they are a summary of accessibility features and warnings and contact details for any queries. Crucially, this data needs to be available before download as well as after. So this is why ONIX is so important here, because websites can use that to display the accessibility properties of a given publication before somebody has actually acquired it. And in terms of content scope, this is perhaps the most contentious part of the EAA. As some of our speakers today have said, it's really not clear exactly whether backlist is in scope and in what way it's in scope. There is mention of a 5-year transitional period or grace period in the EAA for backlist, but it is not, well, it's not clearly explained, and it is not absolutely clear that that applies to publishing. So I would call that an unreliable principle. That doesn't mean everything has to be ready on day one, though. And as Simon just covered, the consensus in the industry is to have prioritized remediation of the most popular titles or whatever measure is appropriate, and then to log and respond to requests for specific titles in a timely manner. That priority plus request system is probably the only reasonable and feasible way to adapt content, just because nobody is going to be able to convert the entire backlist by the 28th of June 2025. We've heard some mention today of exemptions, and we have 3 exemptions to the EAA for disproportionate burden, which is the economic argument, and that really has to be argued for specific features. It's not there to exempt entire publications. Fundamental alteration, that would cover the entire publication. That's where, by making an accessible version, you're really making a completely different book. And then there is this exemption for micro enterprises. It's really important that we look at the detail of all of these, because, I mean, in disproportionate burden, it's only exempting features. We have to renew these every 5 years, and they could be challenged at the Market Surveillance Authority level or in court. So I encourage publishers to not cling to these exemptions. We're going to focus on 2 sectors. Firstly, we're going to look at academic and scholarly. And in scope is ebooks, including PDF ebooks, digital-only publications, and anything book-like. In terms of what's out of scope, well, print-only publications, because the legislation narrowly says ebooks. Journals, which is a contentious part, whether the EAA applies to journals is not yet clear. And research papers. Really what we're looking for is this term ebooks that's in the EAA. What does that cover? What do we mean by ebooks? And that can lead to some difficult situations when trying to work out what is in scope. So what are some of the challenges for academic and scholarly publishing? Well, very large backlist, some of it extremely old, complex content, so the image descriptions can be difficult to do. The authors are not always available to assist where needed. They're not always alive. And it can be hard to define book, as we just talked about. There are some mitigations. So building accessibility steps into new publishing workflow is obviously vital, as we've talked about today. Making use of exemptions where necessary, but again, with caution. And focus more on request response system than deep backlist. You don't need to worry about extremely old books that have not sold in many years. Those are the ones where the request system is the right approach, as long as those requests are logged properly and acted on in a reasonable time frame. And finally, I wanted to talk about accessible PDF, because this is getting asked about a lot. PDF is primarily a visual format, so it's never going to be as accessible as EPUB. And it can't fulfill all of the WCAG and therefore the EAA because of the reflow and resize requirements. But some improvements will make it possible to use it in disproportionate burden cases. The PDF UA standard that Adobe have come up with can be very helpful. They have a built-in wizard for doing this if you have Acrobat Pro. That also has an OCR feature as well. And if you have source files, then exploring best practices for PDF export can make a huge difference. For our other sector focus, we'll look at educational publishing. Now, educational publishing has a similar kind of scope, so ebooks, including PDF, digital only, and anything book-like. Not in scope will be print-only publications. Online courses, and the line between an ebook and an online course can be difficult. And interactive or gamified platforms, some education platforms, could not be reasonably called books. In terms of educational publishing content, it really can be very complex. Especially for sort of textbooks and curriculum material. You can have complex layouts with non-linear ordering. Sometimes there isn't one clear ordering path through the text. Lots of images, interactivity, so quizzes and tests, puzzles, write-in sections, collaboration features. There's also quite often flashing content, which is regulated within the W3C, and audio-video content, which means we need closed captions and video descriptions, what often known as audio description, and available scripts. Now, the difference, of course, with educational publishing is the platform is a much bigger part of it because of the interactivity in lots of educational publishing. So you have to ask, can print-disabled readers operate all the features of the system and fully participate in lessons and homework? This gets really complicated. If you own the platform, then there's lots of development to do. And if you don't own the platform, then there's lots of questions to ask. So you have to look at annotations and notes and answer boxes and highlighting, and also general user interface accessibility. There are many additional W3C criteria that apply if you own the platform as well as the content. So what can you do in these instances? Well, you could produce a fixed layout EPUB. That won't satisfy W3C for reflow or resize. And interactives are limited and challenging to implement, but could be permissible under disproportionate burden. It really depends on the type of content. You could make a rich reflowing EPUB version, which is highly accessible, but again, limited because activities aren't actually possible usually without your own custom platform. You could develop your own custom platform based on HTML or EPUB or augmented EPUB. This is often ideal, but has a very high development and cost burden. So it's usually only available to the larger publishers. Or you could use a dedicated authoring and end user platform. You hear terms like LMS, VLE, that's learning management system or virtual learning environment that was designed for interactive and accessible digital textbooks. So these carry cost, but these problems are unavoidable. And finally, just to quickly talk about accessibility for AI, because everybody asks. And yes, for image description, as our other speakers have said, can be helpful for getting an initial prompt for a checking by a human afterwards. Most products on the market so far don't consider the context of the image. I have now seen some that are starting to try to do that. It's just early days. What an image means is contextual. The meaning of an image varies based on what book it's in, what section it's in, etc. Audience assumptions, their reading level, the position in the individual publication, and just subject norms. Is description even needed? So decorative or surrounding, if the image is decorative, if it's described by surrounding text, or if the caption is already sufficient, then perhaps it didn't need a description. Is the AI describing every image when that wasn't needed? And then there are the IP considerations of using AI. So does the AI respect copyright? Who owns the model? Who's hosting it? Is it using your material for training itself? If it is it applying that training and what it's learned to other publishers' content? These are really important questions to ask. And other uses for AI, I think Christina mentioned this, it's very early days for that. It might have a role in semantic markup, which is kind of adding layers of meaning to code to help assistive technology to work better. That can be quite subjective, so it will be a challenge for AI, but it might be something in its future. And accessibility metadata, some early products are now arriving to attempt to use machine learning and AI to do this. Usually it's more scripting than AI as such, but really, again, human checks are needed. And to go to a more optimistic perspective, what are the opportunities that accessibility and accessible publishing present to us? Well, beyond compliance, As was aptly demonstrated in Simon's talk, this is a massive potential market expansion. It will improve your reputation and show your commitment to inclusivity. And broadly speaking, and this is my favorite point, accessible content is just better digital content. It usually displays more consistently across platforms. It's more portable. The files are more future-proof, and it works better with AI for anything you might want to develop to that end in the future. Rich data is better data. It can also help you stay relevant as procurement gets ahead of legislation. So individual institutions might have higher requirements of what they will buy in for their students than necessarily the letter of the law. It's also just a good moment to assess and optimize what are very often highly entrenched processes. You know, publishers will often stay on the same supplier contract for many, many years. So this is a good moment to think about some of that. And finally, accessibility and the future. Accessible files are inherently more future-proof due to their superior structure and semantic richness. So this develops what I was talking about a moment ago. These files are easier to repurpose and transform. If you're trying to sell this idea to your own higher-ups, you might mention to them that if any of them remember EPUB 2 to 3, well, if EPUB 4 comes along, it'll be a lot easier to convert rich, well-constructed, accessible ebooks to a new format. Wider markets are available. You're prepared for future legislation and for any future platform changes. So these are big and expensive changes to your processes and your products. But this big shift is only once. You know, we're talking about improving processes, not just improving output. And that's all I had to share with you today. I hope that was helpful. I had to kind of rush through, but we really have an amazing array of speakers here and some really fantastic wisdom. So I do encourage you to ask questions of all of us as we share knowledge and attempt to crack this problem together. Thank you.